Well, welcome to the first installment of Two Guys Talking About Oak Park. One of many, perhaps, we don't know. We're just checking it out, testing it out. And I'm with Frank Lipo, Executive Director of the Historical Society of Oak Park River Forest. And he's much more knowledgeable about history than I am, but I've heard a lot of things which I can maybe check out with him. And one of them is
well, and I'm with Ken Trainer.
Yes.
Longtime journalist, newspaperman, columnist with the Wednesday Journal, opinion editor, just, a whole series of jobs you've done there, and in your earlier career related to writing, editing, and being a columnist.
Thank you I always forget to introduce myself. So anyway, we're here at the top of the ridge, which is an interesting geographical wrinkle in Oak Park, and we're also by this wonderful stretch of lawn, which a lot of people refer to as the front lawn of Oak Park. So I was going to ask you, is there any historic basis for that? Has anybody ever designated it that we know of as the front lawn, or is it just a colloquial thing that has grown over the years?
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of both. Scoville Park was the sort of homestead of James Scoville and his family, and where like the War Memorial is at the top of the hill was where like the Scoville mansion was in, from the 1860s was an earlier home, and then in the 1880s they built a grander home kind of on the ridge. And so this today's park is listed on the National Register. They actually formally, listed on the National Register because it has all these layers of history. When the Park District was created in 1912, this is like one of the first 3 pieces of property they bought. Mm-hmm. And so there was sort of this idea that already by 1912, when the Park District was created, that sort of like the avenue, as they called it, like Oak Park Avenue, sort of intersecting Lake Street and then going south toward the train tracks, and then north up here toward Chicago Avenue, was sort of like a spine of like sort of central Oak Park, the business district that was never maybe quite as big as what downtown Oak Park would grow to the west, but it was sort of always this blending of like single family homes going into apartments as it developed, some churches, some sort of fine commercial buildings, this range of sort of like a kind of a crossroads for Oak Park. So I think this idea, doubling back to the idea of like sort of the front lawn, I think that's really true, that any community has like sort of multiple gathering places. When you have kids at the high school, you maybe going to ball games or going to a play, or dropping off, picking up. So that becomes a little bit of your focus. But I think Scoville Park continues to like, at different ages, a sort of gathering place, and that's what's really cool about it. The front lawn idea you said, like, yeah, you see seniors on the benches, you see, kids always, informally, formally, family units. Some of the like the preschools and the schools around here, you'll see kids playing, formally as almost like a playground during like the school year. Obviously, you have recreation with the tennis court, so you have all these kind of uses overlapping. And to me, that's kind of if there's a theme when I think about history, and I enjoy history, is the sort of layers. Like, it's like anybody can just focus on like one battle of the Civil War, and that's if that's your interest, that's great. You know all the details of Gettysburg, but like, how does Gettysburg fit into the Civil War as a whole? Right? And then how does like the Civil War fit into American history and the echoes today as some of these contentious issues? We gotta have this like rebirth of like a states' rights mentality, federal government versus the states, and so you kind of have a lot of these, obviously still never dealt with, the ongoing issue about, never quite fully dealt with, about the sort of repercussions of slavery and discrimination against African American folks from that era, stretching with a strand forward. So it's kind of, to me, that you never get away from the layers. And I think the other thing, just sort of before I let you talk again, as I go on and on, is I think this stretch, like you start off saying about like the front lawn, and to me, like when you look up and down Oak Park Avenue and Lake Street, is kind of that blending is really cool, because there's real anchors of some of the historic buildings, like the 2 Scoville buildings at each corner, the beautiful, orange brick and sort of the Flemish, inspired Scoville one, or the first like Scoville family building.
Red Griffin told me he was based on the Frankfurt Rathaus.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's true or not.
You know, it's interesting in architecture because there's a lot of buildings in Europe and in you know, sort of the Germany into some of the Nordic countries. They're kind of similar. That was a very popular, this kind of so-called Flemish style with this sort of step top. So, and Red told me that one time too. I'm talking about layers of history. I'm looking over. There's a tree that's dedicated to Red Griffin over there. You know, it's like right next to the spot, right? Red Griffin, who was so involved in so many things related to Oak Park culture and history. But you know, that building, the one we're talking about from you know, the orange brick building, that, you know, again, depending on your era, your layer of history, you know, people still call it the Walker's building, or they'll say
department store.
Yeah, the Walker's department store. You know, which was, you know, for generations, for, you know, decades and decades, in that building, which at the corner had the Fannie Mae store for many years, and then Oberweis was in that building for many years, and just relatively recently closed, right?
Yes.
And then across the street, of course, the Oak Park Bank building today, in terms of on the first floor, was Winberry's, and before Winberry's was Gilmore's department store. So like, just even in the buildings there, you get a sense of like, you know, somebody today might like Mulata, or which is at, you know, where that Fannie Mae's used to be, you know, or somebody banks at Oak Park Bank, and I guess there's going to be people already who've moved to Oak Park in the last couple of years who never knew it as Winberry's, or
I'd forgotten that that was Fannie Mae's, but you're right. You know,
so you kind of get
memory comes back really fast as soon as I'm reminded. But Red also mentioned that the Gilmore's building was originally the Masonic Temple, I guess, and that was built Prairie style. Yeah. So he had this wonderful theory about this was the old world on the you know, the Frankfurt Rathaus versus the Prairie style Masonic Temple, Gilmore's, etc. on the other side. So old world versus new world, not versus, old world and new world. Kind of coming together. And I always thought that was a nice way of looking at things. And I've often, because he also mentioned it, that when none of this was here, and James Scoville was standing, supposedly, at least legendarily, on the spot and resting and saying, this is where I want to build my home, and nothing was there, the land would slope down, and you would have a full view of that. And you would see that we're on a ridge, and that ridge is actually a continental divide running, you know, from northeast to southwest through the town, and this is perhaps, I don't know if this is the high point. Do you know?
The ridge itself, I'm not sure if we ever, well, you know, you're sliding into ancient history.
Yes, so right, I know.
So not just like, you know, Scoville coming here in the 1850s and that legendary story. I know that the Oak Park Public Library, which still has kind of in their new building from 20 years ago now, you know, the Scoville Institute is still over the door because Scoville gave land and money to make that sort of like a private library, and then it became a public library. And there's inside the lobby, there's a sort of the plaque from the 1960s library on the door that recounts that story, like on the wall there, you know, that's James Scoville came here and saw this land. So jumping back to the 1850s when he was, you know, according to that legendary story, which, you know, like a lot of legends, there's usually at least some truth to it. Like it's just like completely made up in a, you know, so it just says, you know, we should have this pioneer come here at a certain point. But
when in doubt, believe the legend.
But then again, right? People like, you know, when you're an older guy, you know, and you're looking back, you know, do you sort of to kind of tuck some of the details up a little bit more? But getting back, the layers of history, that's the good thing, and the danger maybe is the connectedness of stuff, because like as I was doing a couple minutes ago, you start thinking about or broadening out the historical like lens on something, and you say you like Lake Street was like an Indian trail. So the Potawatomi, some of the earlier people that, you know, before there was a you know, Chicago as a settlement, there was that sort of crossroads of Lake Michigan and sort of the swampy area around it, that, you know, you could basically already connect the Great Lakes with the Mississippi through a few small portages, so people could, the early highways of like the water travel that people would have, that Potawatomi, Sac Fox, some of the other native groups would like. Yet you also needed land routes, and Lake Street was known as an Indian trail. Like some of the earliest European settlers, like some of the maps say, like a lot of the angle streets in Metro Chicago are actually Indian trails, because like if you look, they're like, we sort of imposed the grid on the prairie. Right. So if something's like a right angle, it's like it wasn't naturally occurring. We just like put it there, right?
That's so inconvenient.
Yeah, so you kind of have that very early history that was very much guided by the geology, as you're talking about the ridge, essentially, 10,000 years ago and more, when the glaciers came through. Essentially, all that ice had to go somewhere when it started to melt, right? It became water. And so Lake Michigan, today's Lake Michigan, we think of Lake Michigan to the east, actually, after the glaciers melted in this sort of area, that water wasn't just Lake Michigan, it actually came out almost to Oak Park. And essentially, there's this kind of sand ridge along the western side of, geologists like refer to like Lake Chicago, like the predecessor of Lake Michigan when it was like bigger. Yeah. And so the sand ridge you're referring to, that like Scoville Park was part of, was sort of like up on this ridge. And it's kind of laughable, of course. We know people from other places or grew up in a more mountainous area.
That's right. Like, the Rocky Mountains.
You're talking about the hill in Scoville Park, but there is this ridge. I think a ridge actually is probably better, right? So this ridge was high enough that say if it rained, and the ridge, like in our area, was sort of up at North and Ridgeland. People know that area. They know those houses on the west that are kind of up a little bit. That's sort of part of that ridge. Right. And then it extended kind of through part of Taylor Park, again, a little hill, little sled hill, and then cut through sort of the Fair Oak subdivision, kind of a state section area over here. And then it did continue down to like where Forest Home Cemetery is by the Des Plaines River. They had taken down, when it became a cemetery, they, through the years, they kind of dug out some of the sand and gravel and sold it. Yeah. So that was also like the ridge continued that way. So here I am talking about tens of thousands of years ago. Yeah. But then after the glaciers melted, the water started receding more, and some of the native peoples who were, often very nomadic, so they were moving around as the land allowed them to, and following buffalo, following the seasons, they actually, then this area became particularly important, because by that point you had the Des Plaines River to the west. You had this ridge that was higher, drier ground, which you often hear like the sort of European pioneers, the high point and the grove of oak trees on the ridge. So for them,
at least it was higher than Chicago, so it wasn't swampy.
Yeah, there's a reason why Chicago, all the Chicago, it's been interpreted different ways, but essentially Chicago is a word sort of referring to like place of stinky onions or place of swampy, like
herbs and horto.
That kind of thing. So it was sort of this, like, it wasn't naturally buildable land. It was sort of floodplain, like west of the rest of the lake, and then obviously Chicago River there. So it wasn't exactly high and dry land. That was one of the advantages. Like when people like Scoville came out here, when the federal government started selling land to settlers and pushing the Potawatomi west of the Mississippi by the Treaty of Chicago in 1833. That actually, what were some of the first settlers looking for? Just raw land, but also this would have been a choice spot, this high ground.
And James Scoville saying, this is a pretty good view. I think I'll build here. Yeah. Basically.
Yeah.
And jumping then forward to the commercial developments, it's fascinating that 1/4 of a central business district has gone undeveloped and remained pastoral all these years, which says something about this community, I think, and its values. Yeah. That they did not allow it to be sold off at some point and become, yet another big building on the corner. Yeah. Which I think is probably pretty unusual in a lot of communities. But the other thing I was thinking about with the front lawn, getting back to that, is that reminds me that I think the 125th birthday of Hemingway is just in a week or so, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah, 1899, right?
Yeah, 1899 to 2024. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
125th, which is significant, and of course the front lawn idea brings back, you know, the legendary saying by Hemingway that this is the town of broad lawns and narrow minds, and this is certainly a broad lawn and a beautiful one. But as you know, and not necessarily many other people know, it's never been documented that he actually said it, though he might have believed it.
Yeah.
Because he was a young Victorian kid who was rebelling against that era and his small town upbringing, and he could very easily have said, I'm shaking the dust of this town off my shoes and going on to bigger things. So he might have believed that Oak Park was a town of broad lawns and narrow minds, and maybe they were at that time, although I think Oak Park has always had pretty broad minds for the time. And yet, nowadays, we have a different reputation. Broad lawns and broader minds could be our village logo, although it's never been suggested. It's also interesting that if you look at the lawn, it's full of little white flowers, which are clover, and lawns are associated with being boring and monotonous and only made of one thing, grass. But this lawn and a lot of other lawns that I've passed in my walks are very diverse horticulturally, and so they become different symbols depending on how you look at it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's that whole idea of like what people's perception is versus the reality. That's the human condition, right? Like, you know,
right.
you think somebody's a certain way till they prove otherwise, or you know, Oak Park's reputation, certainly since the 60s, 68 Fair Housing Ordinance and all the kind of grassroots efforts before and after, you know, the choice to have this 99% white community be welcoming of minority folks, you know, to not be the sort of white flight mentality that had, unfortunately, you know, parts of the West Side, Austin, had been such a massive racial change from white to black that there was like not that sort of idea of integration of like welcoming and living near people. And I think, you know, a lot of the philosophy, you know, not everything was done is, you know, you know, everyone agrees with, you know, you make choices like, how do you go about making a change like that when the sort of general society was really supportive of having people live apart, of having a racial separation was sort of just like both law and practice, and, you know, and depending on where you lived and exactly what laws and practice you're talking about. So I think that is something that like really did change Oak Park, when you just make it, you say like, how can we be different? How can we be countercultural? And I think one of the things they're trying to thread the needle, you know, probably imperfectly, but like, can you keep some of the history we're talking about in the sense of place, but change it and add a layer of like newness, of having a welcoming in a different sort of way? And I think that's something that not a lot of places even try. It's sort of like the free market forces. We'll see what happens, or something, right, versus saying like,
let it happen naturally.
Yeah, let's see what happens. And you know, it was funny. Rupert Wenzel, a trustee of the village at the village board on the village board when they approved the Fair Housing Ordinance, and they, you know, the trustees got death threats from some people like, why are you trying to change Oak Park? You know, we're fine the way we are almost. And he said, well, we knew what happened when communities do nothing in response to possible change, where they just sort of put their head in their sand, or the communities where people sort of run, like, you know, wow, we're just gonna get out of here, I don't like the way things are changing. Like, how do you like embrace change, be more welcoming, do what's like right, what we, you know, the sort of community sense of like, it's just right. Like, what is our version of like the civil rights
or
movement?
could it be better?
Yeah.
You know, even, you know, at the time, a lot of people weren't thinking that way, but to think, what about the constructive side of it? This could be a boon in many ways by being diverse. Yeah. And it's...
How that would actually set up the community and individuals like the chance for success of just being, the world is not 99% white. The world is not, Oak Park's always look around and see some, a range of apartment buildings, even different size homes in different parts of the community. We've always had a certain sort of economic diversity, but generally people think of Oak Park as a, middle class, upper middle class, some pockets of, real wealth. So it's sort of like, what does that look like if it's you start cutting across different cultures? The idea of or different religious groups, right? It was there was resistance to actually physically having synagogues in this community in River Forest. So among
and
some
even
people,
Catholic churches.
Catholic churches very early on, right? These sort of mainline Protestant churches, some of which are right down here on Lake Street. And I always think about history, though. I got to be careful because I think too often in history and in journalism, people sort of like paint the brush like everybody's the same. Like everybody was like this, and then everyone became like this. Like everybody in Oak Park was closed-minded, and everyone became really open-minded or something like that. It's like people.
We have plenty of closed-minded people here.
Yeah. So those narrow minds are there too. So I think it's kind of. I think that's the thing about this is it's not. Obviously at its peak, Oak Park was more than 60,000. Now it's more than 50,000 people, right? I mean, I often throw in River Forest. We at the historical side kind of cover both towns, and there's obviously shared high school, shared community institutions. They're two separate villages, and some things are different between the communities. But just the idea of how you view, like everybody in North Oak Park's like this, and everybody in South Oak Park's like this, or everyone in River Forest like this, right? So there's always those kind of like broad brushes, and you come back and you say, generally, it's like historical trends of enough like leaders, grassroots leaders, and people on the village board and other like taxing bodies that start to say, oh, we are moving this community into a different place. Yeah. Again, imperfectly, kind of fits and starts, a couple steps forward, a step sideways. That's just sort of like life, and I think people, unfortunately, don't always appreciate that. They want to almost make life more black and white. I think it does kind of lead to some of our other problems. Sometimes in society, it's like, you got to be right or you got to be wrong. It's like, well, at our best, we kind of keep on moving between, different ideas and finding some common ground. So, I mean, that's front lawn.
Yeah.
Common ground. I mean, like, what is this?
Right.
That's another way of thinking about like a space like this.
A place to come together.
You come together in like Danner Village. It was just the 50th Danner Village.
That's right.
Which, even that in history is 50th Danner Village. There was 1 year it was canceled. There's 1 year it was like virtual because of COVID, right?
Right.
But, essentially 50 times, setting aside the 1 year that was canceled, 50 times people gathered, virtually in 1 year or like in this park. It's like, that's like that community festival where you're like, I can like join any of these things. I can find out all these things. So I think that's kind of, this space to me represents, you starting off a few minutes ago talking about the front lawn. I kind of think of this as like this corner where you have all the overlapping. I see 1920s apartments. I see all of this space, the range of history, not just one thing. I think that's really kind of the strength of this corner. It's like, it is that front lawn, but it's also, and we can hang out on a bench and talk, but there's all these different lives happening. Just that one apartment unit over here, or that one over there, or in that store, somebody owns that business. Somebody else is working there. It's that kind of crossroads. So we keep on adding like different words, right? Like a front lawn, a crossroads. I think that's really what's so wonderful about this space.
Yeah, that may be a good place to stop for this conversation, and I always learn from you, Frank. It's always wonderful that you have encyclopedic knowledge, and it fills in all the holes in my understanding. So
I'll back to you in terms of your last 35 years and more. Obviously, even going back to your childhood, growing up around here, I'm the fake native since I didn't grow up around here. But working at the Historical Society and just in general, I never stop learning, because there's always, I'll get back there today after this, and somebody will walk in with a story. There's always like, so
Right.
there's sort of the never-ending pursuit of history, which is really fun to me. But we should talk sometime about getting together over at Austin Gardens.
Yes.
And talk about going from the Avenue Business District, the Hemingway District as is known today, over there to downtown Oak Park, and all the changes that have happened there, and also the continuity. Another park that was a private home, but like that is kind of a legacy of the community.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite places. I would look forward to that.
Great.
All right.